Remember the smell of butter and powdered sugar in your grandmother's kitchen every December? In 1950, 30 homemade candies ruled Christmas tables like crown jewels of celebration.
You know how to roll a jelly roll? It's easy if you know how. And it's just as good as it looks. Certainly is fun to work in a modern kitchen.
These weren't recipes. They were love shaped by hand, memories you could taste. Today they've vanished because we abandoned tradition for convenience, forgetting what made Christmas feel like magic. We're racing to capture all 30 before the last grandmothers who made them die. Don't let them disappear. Share this with the person you want beside you in the kitchen when these forgotten Christmas candies return to the table again. Walk into Grandma's kitchen right after Thanksgiving. The radio plays Bing Crosby, and she's tying her apron with flour already on her hands. Divinity drops were always first. She'd beat egg whites until her arm got tired, then pour in hot sugar syrup while I watched the mixture turn glossy and white. The kitchen windows fogged up from all that steam. She'd drop spoonfuls onto wax paper, and they'd sit there looking like little snow peaks. The trick was the weather. You couldn't make divinity on rainy days. "The sugar knows," she'd say, tapping her temple. Step back to 1958, when brown sugar cost a nickel and patience was free. Seafoam was Grandma's secret weapon, the candy she'd bring to church potlucks that made every woman ask for the recipe. She used brown sugar instead of white, and suddenly you had these golden, crunchy clouds that tasted like caramel and honey. She'd add chopped pecans right at the end, folding them gently so they wouldn't sink. I remember biting into seafoam and hearing that perfect crack. Then the way it melted on your tongue like sweet ocean foam. My cousin tried making it once with a hand mixer. It didn't work. Some candies need your grandmother's wooden spoon and strong arms to come out right. This was the candy Grandma hid in the back pantry behind the flour sack. Every Christmas, she'd roll creamy peanut butter with powdered sugar into perfect little balls, then dip each one in melted chocolate using a toothpick. The Betty Crocker book said to use a fork, but Grandma knew better. The toothpick meant every bonbon got covered completely, no bare spots. She'd line them up on cookie sheets, and they looked like tiny treasures from a fancy chocolate shop downtown. We weren't allowed to touch them until Christmas Eve. I snuck one once when I was 9. She knew immediately. She always knew. Now people just buy peanut butter cups from the store. It's not even close to the same thing. Picture Christmas 1963 and Grandma's wearing her good dress because the church ladies are coming over later. This candy had 3 layers, and she made each one with the care of an artist. First came the chocolate bottom, spread thin and even. Then a fluffy cherry center made with maraschino cherry juice and more powdered sugar than seemed possible. Finally, roasted peanuts pressed into the top while everything was still soft. She'd cut them into perfect squares, wiping her knife clean between each slice. The combination sounds strange now, chocolate, cherry, peanuts all together, but one bite and you understood why Christmas felt magical. My mother never learned this one, said it was too complicated. Go back to a snowy December morning when dates came in a box with a picture of a camel on it. Dates were expensive, so this candy only appeared once a year, and we treated it like gold. Grandma would cook chopped dates with sugar until they turned into a dark, sticky paste that smelled like toffee and earth combined. Then came the walnuts, stirred in while the mixture was still bubbling hot. She'd dump it all onto a clean dish towel dusted with powdered sugar, then roll it tight like she was wrapping a baby. After it cooled in the icebox, she'd slice it into circles that looked like tiny pinwheels. Wait, you think those 5 were something special? You haven't tasted anything yet. Grandma's cookbook had 25 more candies hidden in those butter-stained pages. The best ones are still coming, And number 17 will absolutely break your heart. Walk into 1952, when ladies wore hats to go shopping and fudge had fancy names. Opera fudge was what Grandma made when she wanted to impress someone important, maybe the new preacher or her sister visiting from Chicago. It wasn't regular chocolate fudge. This one had marshmallow cream folded in at just the right moment, creating these beautiful swirls of white and brown. She'd pour it into a buttered pan and let it set overnight on the cold back porch. The next day, she'd cut it into diamonds instead of squares because, she said, opera people wouldn't eat square candy. I believed her completely. The texture was smoother than silk, and it melted the second it touched your tongue. Step into the basement on a freezing December afternoon in 1960. Grandma kept her extra icebox down there, and that's where haystacks had to chill before they'd hold their shape. She'd melt butterscotch chips in a double boiler, then stir in an entire bag of shredded coconut and a can of those thin chow mein noodles. Sounds weird, right? But when she dropped spoonfuls onto wax paper, they looked exactly like tiny haystacks sitting in a field, crunchy, sweet, and gone in 2 bites. My brother could eat 6 in a row. Grandma would scold him, but I saw her smile when she thought nobody was looking. These disappeared from Christmas tables when people decided coconut was too old-fashioned. Their loss, I say. This was my grandfather's favorite, the only candy he'd actually ask for by name. Penuche is just a fancy word for brown sugar fudge, but the way Grandma made it, you'd swear it was something from a European bakery. She'd cook brown sugar and cream together until it reached exactly 234 degrees. She had a candy thermometer she trusted more than the preacher. Then she'd beat it with a wooden spoon until her whole arm shook and the fudge turned from shiny to dull. That's when you knew it was ready. She'd press walnut halves into the top while it was still warm, making a pattern that looked like flowers. Grandpa would sit at the table with his coffee, eating one piece very slowly, making it last. Picture the week before Christmas, 1965, when colored marshmallows were the most exciting thing in the grocery store. Grandma saw them and got an idea that wasn't even in her Betty Crocker book. She was going to invent something. She melted butterscotch chips with a little bit of butter, then stirred in those tiny colored marshmallows and salted peanuts. When she spread it thin on a cookie sheet, it looked like confetti frozen in amber. Once it hardened, she'd break it into pieces like peanut brittle, except chewier and more colorful. All the kids at church wanted this candy because it looked like a party. The adults pretended they didn't care, but I saw them sneaking pieces when they thought nobody was watching. You can't find those little marshmallows anymore. Everything's different now. Go back to a time when pulling taffy was entertainment, when families gathered in the kitchen just to stretch candy until their arms hurt. Grandma would cook molasses, sugar, and vinegar together until it reached the hard crack stage, then pour it onto a buttered marble slab she kept just for this purpose. We'd wait, bouncing on our toes, until it was cool enough to touch. Then came the magic part. She'd butter our hands, and we'd pull that dark taffy between us, stretching it longer and longer until it turned from black to gold. It took 30 minutes of pulling to get the color right. When we finally cut it into pieces with scissors, we were exhausted and happy. Molasses taffy tastes like hard work and laughter. Nobody pulls taffy by hand anymore. Too much effort, they say. They're missing out on the whole point. Walk into Christmas Eve, 1957, when Grandma stood at the stove for 2 straight hours, stirring a heavy copper pot. Real caramels can't be rushed, she'd say. And she meant it. She'd combine cream, butter, sugar, and corn syrup, Then stir constantly while the mixture turned from pale yellow to deep amber. The whole house smelled like burnt sugar and heaven mixed together. She'd test it by dropping tiny bits into cold water until they formed perfect soft balls in her fingers. Then she'd pour everything into a buttered pan lined with wax paper and let it set overnight on the cold porch. The next morning, she'd cut them into small squares with a knife she'd dipped in hot water, wiping it clean after each cut. Then came the wrapping, each caramel wrapped individually in wax paper, the ends twisted like little presents. These weren't those hard grocery store caramels that stick to your teeth and taste like plastic. These were soft enough to bite without effort, chewy enough to last a few seconds, buttery enough to make you close your eyes and forget the world. Making real caramels takes love and time and patience. All three are in short supply these days, which is why nobody makes them anymore. Step back to a time when popcorn balls were the highlight of every Christmas party, bigger than your fist and sticky as tree sap. Grandma would pop corn in hot oil on the stove top. No microwaves existed back then, and the popping sound would bring all us kids running to the kitchen like it was a fire alarm. While the popcorn cooled in her biggest mixing bowl, the one with the chipped rim, she'd make a syrup from white sugar, corn syrup, butter, and just a pinch of salt. She'd cook it until it turned golden and smelled like candy apples at the county fair. Then came the tricky part that separated the good cooks from the great ones, pouring that hot syrup over the popcorn and mixing it fast with a wooden spoon before everything turned into one giant brick. She'd butter her hands thick and shape the mixture into perfect round balls while it was still warm enough to mold, but cool enough not to burn. Each ball got wrapped in colored cellophane, red, green, silver, and tied with curling ribbon. We'd hang some on the Christmas tree like ornaments, though by New Year's most had been secretly eaten in the night. This was Grandma's church bazaar candy, the one she made in complete secret so none of the other ladies could steal her technique. Picture a quiet Sunday afternoon in 1961, curtains drawn, and she's standing at the stove boiling sugar, corn syrup, and fresh squeezed orange juice together. The steam rising from that pot smelled like summer in December. She'd cook it slowly, stirring every few minutes until her candy thermometer read exactly 238 degrees. But she never trusted that thermometer completely. She had this theory that they were all manufactured wrong, so she'd test the syrup the old way, dropping little bits into a cup of cold water and checking if they formed firm balls between her fingers. When everything was perfect, she'd pour the bright orange mixture into a pan she'd dusted with cornstarch and let it sit undisturbed for a full day and night. The next afternoon, she'd cut it into wedge shapes with a sharp knife, then use her fingers to round the edges so they looked like real orange slices. Finally, she'd roll each piece in granulated sugar until they sparkled like jewels. They looked so realistic that people would bite into them expecting actual fruit and get surprised by pure candy instead. The flavor was sunshine captured in sugar, sweet and tangy, and absolutely perfect. These jellies took 3 full days from start to finish. 3 days of work for candy that disappeared in 3 minutes at the church sale. Go back to Christmas 1959, when adults had their own special candy that kids weren't allowed to touch under any circumstances. Grandma kept rum balls in a separate tin with a tight lid, hidden on the top shelf of the pantry where little hands couldn't reach even with a chair. She'd crush an entire box of vanilla wafers into fine crumbs using her rolling pin, then mix those crumbs with dark cocoa powder, powdered sugar, light corn syrup, and just enough dark rum to make the mixture stick together and smell dangerous. Then she'd roll everything into smooth balls, about the size of walnuts, and coat each one in a thick layer of powdered sugar that looked like fresh snow. They sat in their tin, looking completely innocent, like little snowballs waiting for a winter fight, but one bite told you these were absolutely grown-up treats. My Uncle Charlie would eat 3 at a time during Christmas dinner and declare them the single best thing about the entire holiday. The rum flavor was strong enough to taste clearly, but gentle enough to enjoy without coughing. The texture was dense and rich, almost like chocolate truffles from a fancy store downtown. Now people are too worried about putting alcohol in desserts, scared their kids might accidentally eat one. They don't know what they're missing. Walk into the kitchen on December 23, 1964, when candy canes cost exactly 1 penny each, and peppermint was the official smell of Christmas everywhere you went. Grandma would buy a whole box of candy canes, the thick ones with real peppermint flavor, not those chemical-tasting ones they sell now, and unwrap every single one. Then she'd put them all inside a clean dish towel, fold it over, and crush them with her wooden rolling pin. You could hear that crunching sound through the whole house, and we'd all know exactly what she was making without even asking. While the crushed peppermint waited in its towel, she'd melt dark chocolate squares in her double boiler, stirring constantly so it wouldn't burn or seize up. She'd pour that melted chocolate onto a cookie sheet lined with wax paper, spreading it thin and even with a spatula. Before the chocolate had any chance to harden, she'd sprinkle those crushed candy canes all over the top like red and white snow, pressing them gently into the chocolate with her palm so they'd stick when everything cooled. Once it set completely hard, she'd break it into irregular pieces like glass shards, each piece striped with peppermint and dark chocolate. The combination was bold and festive and absolutely perfect, the bitter dark chocolate against the sharp, sweet peppermint. Now you can buy peppermint bark at every fancy store in town, packaged in expensive boxes with ribbons, but it's never quite as good as what Grandma made. They use milk chocolate instead of dark, or not enough peppermint, or they add white chocolate that doesn't belong there. Simple is always better than fancy. You're halfway through now, and I need to tell you something important. These last 15 candies aren't just recipes, they're warnings. Warnings about what we lose when we forget to make things by hand. Stay with me. This candy has a name that sounds like a town in New England, and that's exactly where the recipe came from originally. Grandma's older sister married a man from Portland, Maine, and she brought this recipe back with her in 1953, like a souvenir you could eat. Needhams have 2 parts, a potato filling and a chocolate coating, and yes, you read that right, it starts with an actual potato. Grandma would boil 1 medium potato until it was soft, mash it completely smooth while it was still hot, then mix in powdered sugar and shredded coconut until it formed a dough that smelled like the ocean and sweetness combined together. She'd shape that mixture into small rectangles, place them on wax paper, and let them dry out overnight in the coolest room of the house. The next day, she'd melt chocolate coating in her double boiler and dip each piece until it was covered completely. The finished candy looked like fancy chocolates from a department store candy counter. When you bit into one, the inside was soft and coconut sweet, and nobody, absolutely nobody, could guess there was potato hidden in there. It was Grandma's favorite trick to play on people. She'd watch them eat one, wait until they said how delicious it was, then tell them about the potato. Their faces would freeze in confusion and disbelief. Needhams disappeared because people couldn't believe potato belonged in candy, even though it worked perfectly as a binder and added nothing but texture. Sometimes the best recipes sound strange until you actually taste them, but nobody wants to try anymore. They've forgotten that weird combinations can create magic if you trust the person who's teaching you. Step into the parlor on New Year's Eve, 1962, when Grandma made candy fancy enough for a president's wife. These bonbons were special occasion treats, the kind she only made once a year when she wanted to impress someone or celebrate something important. The filling was made from cream cheese, butter, powdered sugar, chopped pecans, and shredded coconut, all mixed together until it formed a soft dough that tasted like cheesecake and paradise combined. She'd scoop out small portions with a melon baller, roll them into perfect spheres between her palms, and let them chill in the refrigerator for at least 2 hours until they were firm enough to dip. The chocolate coating had to be tempered just right. Too hot, and it would slide off. Too cool, and it wouldn't stick properly. Grandma had this instinct about temperature that came from years of practice. She'd dip each bonbon using a fork, tap off the excess chocolate, and place them on wax paper to set. When they were finished, they looked exactly like expensive candy store chocolates, the kind that came in gold boxes with satin ribbons. The inside stayed creamy and rich, the outside crisp and dark. One bonbon was enough to satisfy you completely. Two felt like pure luxury. These candies required patience, skill, and ingredients that cost real money during a time when money was tight for most families. That's why Grandma only made them once a year, and why we treated each one like it was precious. When she passed away, she took the exact technique with her. My mother tried to make them once from the recipe card, but they didn't turn out the same. Something about the way Grandma handled the dough, or the exact temperature she kept the chocolate, or maybe just the love she put into every single motion. You can't write down instinct. You can't pass down feeling through words on paper. Go back to a Christmas party in 1958 when bourbon was cheaper than milk, and nobody worried about serving spiked candy to adults at holiday gatherings. Bourbon balls were Grandma's response to the men who complained that all Christmas candy was too sweet and girly. She'd crush vanilla wafers and pecans together until they were fine as powder, then mix in cocoa powder, powdered sugar, light corn syrup, and enough bourbon to make the kitchen smell like a saloon. The mixture would be sticky and dark and smell like trouble in the very best way. She'd roll the mixture into balls about the size of marbles, then roll each one in granulated sugar until they were covered completely. They'd sit in a tin for at least 3 days before she'd serve them. The bourbon needed time to mellow and blend with the other flavors. By Christmas Eve, they were perfect. The outside was slightly crunchy from the sugar. The inside was dense and rich, and the bourbon flavor hit you square in the chest in the most satisfying way possible. My grandfather would eat one slowly with his coffee after dinner, savoring every bite like it was medicine for his soul. Women would eat them too, though they'd pretend they didn't really like them, and only had one to be polite. Then you'd see them sneaking back to the candy table later when they thought nobody was watching. Bourbon balls were candy for people who didn't really like candy, dessert for people who thought dessert was childish. Now you can't serve alcohol-based treats at most gatherings because someone always complains or worries or makes rules. So bourbon balls disappeared, along with the kind of adults who understood that sometimes you need candy with a little bite to it. Walk into the kitchen 3 days before Christmas in 1965, when coconut came in bags, not plastic packages, and still tasted like the real thing. These bonbons were pure simplicity: sweetened condensed milk, shredded coconut, powdered sugar, and vanilla extract mixed together until they formed a dough that stuck to your fingers like glue. Grandma would scoop out small amounts, roll them into balls, and press a whole pecan into the top of each one like she was marking them with her signature. Then they'd go into the refrigerator to firm up overnight. The next day came the chocolate coating part, and this was where skill separated the amateurs from the experts. The chocolate had to be melted perfectly smooth, not too thick or too thin, and the bonbons had to be cold enough that the chocolate would set quickly, but not so cold that the chocolate would crack when it hardened. Step back to a December evening in 1960 when making peanut brittle was a family event that required everyone's attention and quick hands. Grandma would start by cooking sugar, corn syrup, and water together until the mixture reached 280 degrees, the soft crack stage, she called it. Then she'd add raw Spanish peanuts, the small red-skinned ones you can barely find anymore, and keep cooking while stirring constantly. The smell was incredible. Toasted peanuts and caramelized sugar filling every room of the house. When the temperature hit exactly 300 degrees, she'd remove the pot from heat, stir in butter, vanilla, and baking soda all at once. The mixture would foam up dramatically like a science experiment. Then came the critical moment. She had to pour that molten candy onto a buttered marble slab and spread it thin using a metal spatula before it hardened into a solid mass. She'd work fast, stretching the candy as thin as possible while it was still pliable, racing against time and temperature. If you waited even 30 seconds too long, the brittle would be too thick and hard to chew. If you spread it too soon, it wouldn't hold together. The timing had to be absolutely perfect, which meant you couldn't talk to her or distract her during this crucial minute. We'd all stand back and watch in complete silence while Grandma performed her annual peanut brittle miracle. Once it cooled completely, she'd break it into pieces by hitting it with a butter knife handle. Each piece irregular and beautiful like stained glass. The brittle was thin enough to see light through it, crunchy enough to make your jaw work, sweet enough to make you close your eyes, and salty enough from the peanuts to keep you coming back for more. Store-bought peanut brittle is thick as cardboard and breaks your teeth. Real peanut brittle is delicate art that dissolves on your tongue. Nobody has the skill or patience to make it right anymore. The last 10 candies Grandma made were the ones she learned from her own grandmother, recipes that traveled across an ocean and survived wars and depressions and generations. These aren't just sweets, they're heirlooms made of sugar. How you think about Christmas forever. Walk into Christmas, 1956, back when almonds came whole, and you had to blanch them yourself by boiling them and slipping off their brown skins one by one. This was the candy Grandma only made every 5 years or so, because marzipan required a level of patience and artistry that she saved for truly special occasions, maybe a golden anniversary, or when the whole extended family gathered from different states, or when she wanted to prove to herself she still had the skill her grandmother taught her decades ago in the old country. Marzipan starts with blanched almonds, ground so fine they turn into powder as soft as flour. Grandma would run them through her old hand-crank meat grinder 3 times, then mix the almond powder with powdered sugar and just enough corn syrup to bind everything into a smooth dough that smelled like pure almonds and vanilla. The dough had to rest overnight, covered with a damp cloth before it was ready to shape. The next morning, she'd separate the dough into portions and color each one with a few drops of food coloring. Yellow for lemons, red for apples, orange for oranges, green for pears. Then came the artistry part that separated talented cooks from true craftspeople. Using only her hands and a few small tools, a butter knife, a toothpick, a grater, she'd shape that colored marzipan into fruits so realistic you'd swear they were real. She'd roll a ball of yellow dough, pinch one end into a point, use the grater to create lemon skin texture, add a tiny green leaf made from green dough, and suddenly she'd created a lemon small enough to fit in your palm but detailed enough to fool your eye. She'd make tiny apples with stems, little pears with freckles, oranges with dimpled skin, strawberries with seeds pressed in using a toothpick tip. The whole process took 3 days from grinding almonds to finishing the last fruit. She'd arrange them in a shallow box lined with tissue paper, like a farmer's market in miniature. When you bit into a marzipan fruit, the almond flavor was intense and pure. The texture was smooth and slightly chewy, and the sweetness was perfectly balanced. These weren't treats you ate casually. These were small sculptures you appreciated before eating slowly, savoring every tiny bite. Marzipan fruits required ingredients that cost real money, skills that took years to develop, and time that modern life doesn't allow anymore. That's why they've vanished from Christmas tables. We traded beauty for convenience and lost something we didn't know was precious until it was already gone forever. Step back to 1953, when Grandma's kitchen became a place of mystery and magic and strange ingredients nobody else in the neighborhood had ever heard of. Turkish delight wasn't in her Betty Crocker cookbook. This recipe came from a woman at church whose family had immigrated from somewhere in the Middle East, and she'd written the instructions on a piece of paper torn from a child's notebook. Grandma kept that paper in her recipe box for 40 years, and I still remember the careful pencil handwriting that looked like it came from another world entirely. Making Turkish delight meant boiling sugar, water, and lemon juice together until they reached exactly 240 degrees, then slowly whisking in cornstarch that had been mixed with more water until the mixture turned from liquid to gel. This process took nearly an hour of constant stirring over medium heat, and your arm would ache before you were even halfway done. The mixture would go through stages. First thin and milky, then thick like pudding, then clear like glass, and finally it would reach this magical state where it was translucent and thick and shimmered in the light. That's when Grandma would add rose water and more lemon juice, then pour the whole thing into a pan dusted with powdered sugar and cornstarch mixed together. The Turkish delight had to sit undisturbed for a full day and night before it was ready to cut. When Grandma finally turned it out onto her cutting board, it was this beautiful pale pink slab that jiggled slightly when you touched it. She'd cut it into squares with a knife dipped in the powdered sugar mixture, then toss each piece until it was coated completely in white powder. The finished candies looked like little pillows dusted with snow. When you bit into one, the texture was unlike anything else in the world, soft and chewy and melting all at the same time. The flavor was floral and sweet, with a hint of lemon brightness underneath, exotic and strange and completely wonderful. My father said they tasted like perfume and refused to eat them. My uncle said they tasted like Grandma was trying to poison us with flowers, but I loved them, and so did Grandma. So we'd sit together and eat Turkish delight while everyone else had ordinary fudge, and she'd tell me stories about faraway places where people ate rose petals and thought it was normal. Turkish delight disappeared because Americans decided floral flavors didn't belong in candy, and because spending 2 hours stirring a pot was ridiculous when you could just buy chocolate. We lost our sense of adventure along with the recipe. Go back to a cold December afternoon in 1959 when Grandma decided to make the one candy that scared even experienced cooks, English toffee with almond. This wasn't a recipe you attempted lightly. This was a recipe that required confidence, precision, perfect timing, and a little bit of luck with the weather, because humidity could ruin everything. She'd only make toffee on dry, cold days when the air was crisp enough to see your breath outside. "The sugar knows the weather," she'd say, the same thing she said about divinity. And she absolutely believed it. The process started simple enough. Butter and sugar cooked together in a heavy pan, stirring constantly. But here's where toffee separated itself from every other candy. You had to cook it to exactly 290 degrees, the soft crack stage where sugar transforms from syrup into something that will shatter like glass when it cools. Undercook it by even 5 degrees and you get chewy toffee that sticks to your teeth. Overcook it by 5 degrees and you get burned, bitter toffee that tastes like cigarettes. The window for perfection was tiny, and Grandma watched that thermometer like it was the most important thing in the world, which at that moment it absolutely was. When the toffee hit 290 exactly, she'd pour it onto a buttered cookie sheet and work fast to spread it thin with a metal spatula. Then, while it was still hot and soft, she'd press sliced almonds into the top, covering every inch. The almonds would toast slightly from the residual heat. releasing their oils and perfume. Once the toffee cooled to room temperature, she'd flip the whole sheet over and spread melted chocolate across the bottom, then press more almonds into the chocolate before it set. The finished product was a two-sided masterpiece. Crunchy toffee studded with almonds on both sides, chocolate coating on the bottom, sweet and buttery and nutty all at once. When you broke it into pieces and bit in, you experienced about 6 different textures simultaneously: the crack of the toffee, the snap of the chocolate, the crunch of the almonds. The flavor was butter and caramel and nuts and chocolate having a conversation in your mouth. This was Christmas in candy form, expensive and time-consuming, and absolutely worth every second and every penny. Grandma would make 3 batches every December. One for us, one to give away, and one to hide for herself that she thought nobody knew about. I knew. I always knew. Almond toffee disappeared because butter got expensive, because precision got inconvenient, because people decided good enough was close enough. But good enough never tasted like this, never even came close. Walk into Christmas Eve morning 1961, when Grandma would finally bring out the candies she'd been hiding in the cold basement for 3 weeks. Chocolate-covered cherries were her masterpiece, the candy that required more planning and patience than anything else she made all year. The process started before Thanksgiving, because the cherries had to cure inside their chocolate shells for at least 2 weeks before they'd develop that magical liquid center that made them special. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't cheat it. Time was the secret ingredient nobody could buy or fake. She'd start with a jar of maraschino cherries with stems still attached, draining them completely and letting them air dry on paper towels for hours until they were just barely sticky. While they dried, she'd make a special fondant from butter, corn syrup, powdered sugar, and vanilla, mixing it until it formed a dough that could be wrapped around each cherry like a little coat. This was delicate work. The fondant layer had to be thick enough to hold together, but thin enough not to overwhelm the cherry. She'd wrap each cherry completely, leaving just the stem poking out, then set them on wax paper to firm up in the refrigerator. The next day came the chocolate coating, which was its own kind of art. The chocolate had to be melted and tempered properly. Too hot, and it would never set. Too cool, and it would be thick and lumpy. Grandma would hold each cherry by its stem, dip it into the chocolate until it was covered completely, let the excess drip off, then set it on wax paper to harden. She'd make 100 of them at once, maybe more, standing at the counter for hours until her back ached and her fingers were stained red from cherry juice. Then the candies would go into a tin with wax paper between each layer, and she'd hide them in the basement where the temperature stayed just above freezing. Over the next 2 to 3 weeks, something magical happened inside those chocolates. An enzyme in the cherries would break down the fondant coating, turning it from solid dough into a sweet liquid syrup that surrounded the cherry like a moat. By Christmas Eve, when Grandma finally brought them upstairs, each chocolate held a whole cherry floating in liquid sweetness, encased in dark chocolate. When you bit into one, the liquid would flood your mouth, sweet and fruity and absolutely perfect. Making chocolate-covered cherries required chemistry, patience, perfect technique, and weeks of planning. That's exactly why nobody makes them anymore. Now people just buy them in a box from the drugstore, and they taste like plastic fruit and fake chocolate. They'll never know what they missed. Step into a February afternoon in 1958. Because coconut ice wasn't actually a Christmas candy, it was the candy Grandma made in winter when fresh snow covered the ground, and she was feeling homesick for England, where she'd spent 3 years during the war working in a factory that made uniforms for soldiers. She never talked much about those years, but sometimes in February she'd get quiet and distant, and then she'd pull out her big bowl and start making coconut ice, the way the English ladies had taught her when she was 19 and far from home. The recipe was startlingly simple, which was part of its genius. Sweetened condensed milk, powdered sugar, and shredded coconut mixed together until they formed a stiff dough that was white as snow and smelled like tropical islands and sweet cream. She'd press half of it into a pan lined with wax paper, packing it down firm and even. Then she'd take the other half, color it pink with just a few drops of food coloring, and press that layer on top of the white. The two colors never mixed perfectly. You'd get these beautiful swirls where pink met white, like a sunset frozen in candy. After it set in the refrigerator overnight, she'd cut the coconut ice into small squares. The texture was unique, not quite fudge, not quite fondant, not quite candy, but something in between all three. It was dense and sweet and rich, and the coconut gave it a slight chewiness that kept your mouth interested. The flavor was pure sweetness with a hint of coconut. Nothing complicated or fancy, just honest sugar and cream and tropical flakes. This was candy for people who'd survived hard times and wanted something simple and beautiful to remind them that life could be sweet again. Grandma would eat one piece very slowly, sitting by the window and looking out at the snow, and I knew better than to interrupt whatever memories were playing in her head. Then she'd shake herself, smile at me, and offer me a piece like nothing had happened. Coconut ice disappeared because it wasn't flashy enough to compete with chocolate and caramel, because simple stopped being valued once fancy became available, because nobody wanted to remember war years anymore, even the sweetness that got people through them. I wish I'd asked Grandma more questions about England while I still had the chance. I wish I'd written down more than just the recipe. Some things you lose forever, and you don't realize it until the person who held them is gone, and the candy they made tastes like memory you can't quite reach anymore. 5 candies left, and these are the ones that hold Grandma's biggest secrets. The techniques she learned from her mother, who learned from her mother, going back generations to a time when candy was the only luxury poor families could afford. We're almost home. Walk into 1955 when brown sugar came in solid bricks you had to chip apart with a knife, and butterscotch was everyone's favorite flavor before chocolate took over the world. Grandma's butterscotch squares weren't just candy, they were little tiles of amber sunshine that tasted like butter, and molasses and brown sugar all grew up together and became something better than any of them could be alone. She only made these in fall and winter, never in summer, because the heat and humidity would turn them soft and sticky before they even finished cooling. The process required constant attention and strong arms. She'd melt real butter in her heaviest pan, then add dark brown sugar, and cook them together while stirring continuously, watching the mixture bubble and foam like a witch's cauldron. The smell would fill the entire house, toasted butter, caramel, that deep molasses sweetness that brown sugar carries. She'd cook it to exactly 290 degrees, testing it the old-fashioned way by dropping bits into cold water to see if they'd form hard, crackable balls. When the temperature was perfect, she'd remove the pan from heat, stir in heavy cream and vanilla extract, then pour the whole thing into a buttered pan and let it cool completely before cutting. The hardest part was waiting. The butterscotch had to cool for at least 4 hours before you could cut it, and it had to be room temperature or the knife would drag and tear instead of slicing clean. Grandma would score it into squares while it was still slightly warm, then let it finish cooling overnight. The next morning, she'd break it along the scored lines and wrap each piece individually in wax paper, twisting the ends tight. The finished squares were hard, but not brittle, smooth, but not slick, and they melted slowly on your tongue, releasing layer after layer of butterscotch flavor that seemed to last forever. You couldn't eat these fast. You had to suck on them, let them dissolve gradually, taste each stage as the candy went from hard to soft to syrup to memory. My grandfather would keep one in his cheek while he read the evening paper, and it would last him the entire front section and sports page combined. Butterscotch squares disappeared when people decided hard candy was old-fashioned and boring compared to chocolate, when slow eating stopped being valued in a world that wants everything fast, when butter got expensive and nobody wanted to stand at a stove stirring for 40 minutes anymore. We traded patience for speed and lost the flavor that comes from taking your time. Step back to a humid September afternoon in 1962 when Grandma's sister came to visit from New Orleans, bringing stories about jazz music and strange food and a candy recipe that would change everything. Pralines were a Southern specialty, pronounced pralines, not pralines, and making them correctly required understanding humidity and sugar chemistry in ways that most Northern cooks never learned. Grandma failed 3 times before she got them right, and I watched all 3 failures turn into grainy, sugary disasters that ended up in the trash. But the 4th time, something clicked, and she made perfect pralines that looked like they came from a French Quarter candy shop. The recipe seemed simple on paper. Brown sugar, white sugar, cream, butter, and pecans cooked together, then dropped by spoonfuls onto wax paper. But the execution was incredibly difficult because pralines had to be cooked to exactly the right temperature, stirred at exactly the right speed, and dropped onto paper at exactly the right moment when the mixture was just starting to lose its gloss, but before it hardened completely. Wait 5 seconds too long, and the whole batch would solidify in the pan. Drop them 5 seconds too early, and they'd spread into thin puddles instead of holding their shape. Grandma would stand at the stove with intense focus, cooking the sugar mixture to 236 degrees, soft ball stage, then removing it from heat and stirring in pecans. Then came the critical moment. She'd stir continuously, watching the mixture like a hawk, waiting for it to change from shiny to slightly dull, from liquid to just barely thick. When the moment arrived, she'd move fast, dropping spoonfuls onto wax paper, working quickly before the window closed. The finished pralines were round and flat, with bumpy surfaces from all those pecans, and they'd set up with a creamy, fudge-like texture that was completely different from any other candy. When you bit into a praline, you got butterscotch sweetness, nutty richness, and a texture that was somehow both creamy and grainy at the same time, dissolving on your tongue while the pecans provided crunch. These were sophisticated candies that tasted like the South, warm and rich and complicated and completely addictive. Grandma only made them a few times a year because they stressed her out more than any other candy, but when she did make them, they'd disappear within hours. Pralines vanished from home kitchens because getting them right was too hard, because failure meant wasted ingredients and time, because convenience beat difficulty every single time. Now you can buy them in tourist shops in New Orleans, but they're made in factories by machines that don't understand the soul of what they're creating. They taste okay. They're not magic. Magic requires human hands that care about getting it right. Go back to a freezing January night in 1957 when Grandma would gather all the kids around the kitchen table for an event that felt like entertainment and candy making combined into one magical experience. Pulled mints were the only candy we got to help make, the only one where children's hands were not just allowed, but necessary. You needed at least 4 people to pull mints correctly, and Grandma would recruit whoever was visiting, cousins, neighbors, kids from church, until she had enough helpers to make the project work. She'd cook sugar, water, and cream of tartar together until the mixture reached 260 degrees, hard ball stage, then pour it onto her marble slab that she'd rubbed with butter until it shone. The hot syrup would spread across the marble like glass, steaming and dangerous. She'd add a few drops of peppermint oil and food coloring around the edges. Then we'd wait, watching that pool of sugar slowly cool from bubbling hot to warm enough to touch. She'd test it with her finger, pressing gently, waiting for that moment when it was cool enough not to burn, but still warm enough to be pliable. Then the pulling began. She'd fold the edges of the candy mass toward the center, gathering it into a ball, then stretch it out into a rope and fold it back on itself. Over and over, pulling and folding, and she'd hand sections to each of us kids. We'd work in pairs, pulling the candy between us like taffy, stretching it out long, then bringing our hands back together, watching the candy go from clear to cloudy to opaque white as we pulled air into it. Our arms would get tired, Our hands would get sticky. We'd laugh and compete to see who could pull their section the longest. The kitchen would smell like pure peppermint, sharp and clean, and strong enough to clear your sinuses. After about 10 minutes of pulling, the candy would start to resist, getting harder to stretch, and that's when Grandma would take over again. She'd gather all our sections together, roll the whole mass into a long rope about as thick as your thumb, then use scissors to cut it into little pillow-shaped pieces. Those pieces would harden as they cooled into perfect after-dinner mints, white, smooth, crisp on the outside, slightly chewy on the inside, tasting like peppermint and childhood and effort that was worth it. Pulled mints disappeared because they required a crowd, required time, required people being together in one kitchen with nothing to do except make candy and talk and laugh. We lost that kind of togetherness. We lost the idea that candy making could be the entertainment itself, not just a chore to get done quickly. Now we're all too busy, too separate, too convinced that bonding has to happen somewhere other than around a kitchen table with sticky hands and tired arms and peppermint oil filling the air. Walk into the kitchen on a gray February morning in 1960, when citrus fruit was still precious and nothing went to waste, especially not the bright orange peels that held almost as much flavor as the fruit inside. Grandma saved orange peels all winter long, storing them in a bowl of water in the refrigerator, changing the water every few days so they wouldn't spoil. By early February, she'd have enough peels to make several batches of candied orange peel, candy that was sophisticated and bittersweet and definitely not for children, though I developed a taste for it young because I wanted to seem grown up. The process took 3 days from start to finish, and every step was essential. First, she'd cut the peels into strips about a 1/4 inch wide, then boil them in plain water for 10 minutes, drain them, and repeat 2 more times. This removed the bitterness from the white pith while keeping the orange oil flavor in the outer skin. After the 3rd boiling, she'd make a simple syrup from sugar and water, add the orange peels, and simmer them for almost 2 hours until they turned translucent and glossy like stained glass. The house would smell like concentrated orange, sweet and sharp and bright enough to cut through the gray winter darkness outside. After simmering, she'd drain the peels and lay them on a wire rack overnight to dry slightly. The next day, she'd toss them in granulated sugar until each strip was coated completely, then lay them out again to dry for another full day. The finished candied peels were beautiful, orange and white stripes covered in crystallized sugar, sticky and chewy and sweet with that characteristic orange bitterness underneath. They were both candy and fruit, both treat and preservation, both simple and complex. You'd chew them slowly, and the flavor would build and change. First sweet, then orange, then slightly bitter, then sweet again, as the sugar coating dissolved. Grandma would pack candied orange peel in tins and give them as gifts to her most sophisticated friends, the ones who drank tea instead of coffee, the ones who'd traveled to Europe, the ones who appreciated things that weren't just sweet but interesting. The rest of us would steal pieces from the tin when she wasn't looking, even though we didn't fully appreciate what we were eating. Candied orange peel disappeared because bitter flavors fell out of fashion in a world that wants everything sweet and easy. Because 3 days of work for a few ounces of candy seemed ridiculous to people with too much to do. Because letting citrus peels sit in your refrigerator for weeks felt unsanitary to a generation that throws everything away. We lost the taste for complexity. We lost the patience for transformation. We lost the understanding that sometimes the peel is more precious than what it protected. Step back to December 1954, before modern medicine, Before cough syrup came in bottles, when treating a winter cold meant candy that was both medicine and treat combined into one strange, bitter, unforgettable experience. Horehound drops were the last candy Grandma would make each Christmas season, and they weren't really for enjoying, they were for surviving. Horehound is a bitter herb that grows wild in fields. Looks like mint, but tastes like medicine mixed with licorice and regret. Old-timers swore it would cure anything from coughs to croup to whatever was making you feel poorly that particular winter. Grandma would start with dried horehound leaves she'd gotten from the herb lady at the farmer's market, a woman who dressed all in black and smelled like forest floor and knew things about plants that seemed close to witchcraft. She'd steep those leaves in boiling water for an hour, creating a dark tea that smelled medicinal and slightly menacing. Then she'd strain out the leaves, add sugar and corn syrup to the horehound tea, and cook it to exactly 300 degrees, hard crack stage, stirring constantly while that bitter herbal smell filled the kitchen and made us all slightly nauseous, but also strangely comforted. When the mixture reached temperature, she'd pour it onto a buttered marble slab and let it cool just enough to handle. Then she'd cut it into small squares with oiled scissors before it hardened completely. The finished drops were dark amber-colored, hard as glass, and tasted like bitterness with just enough sweetness to make them bearable. When any of us got a cough that winter, Grandma would hand us a horehound drop with instructions to let it dissolve slowly in our mouths. We'd protest. They tasted terrible compared to regular candy, but she'd give us that look that meant no arguments. So we'd suck on those bitter drops and feel them coating our throats with something that was probably medicinal or possibly just proof that Grandma's generation believed suffering built character. Horehound drops worked, though. Or maybe we just believed they worked, which is the same thing when you're 8 years old and sick and your grandmother is taking care of you. They disappeared when real medicine became easy and cheap, when doctors could prescribe actual cough syrup that tasted like cherries instead of regret, when treating illness with candy seemed old-fashioned and possibly dangerous. But I remember those dark, bitter drops, and I remember that sometimes the things that help you aren't supposed to taste good. Sometimes medicine is medicine, even when it comes wrapped in sugar. Grandma understood that. She understood that not everything sweet has to be pleasant, and not everything that heals you has to make you happy while it's working. That was her final candy lesson, and maybe the most important one she ever taught. So there they are. 30 candies from Grandma's red Betty Crocker cookbook, and her own handwritten recipe cards and the knowledge she carried in her head from women who taught her and women who taught them. Going back generations to a time when candy making wasn't a hobby but a necessity, a celebration, a way of marking time and showing love without saying words that might have felt too vulnerable or too raw to speak aloud in those harder times. I close my eyes and I'm back in that kitchen, standing on the wooden stool with the wobbly leg that she'd wedged steady with a folded piece of cardboard, watching her flour-dusted hands move with confidence and grace through steps she'd done so many times. She didn't need to think anymore, didn't need to measure or check temperatures because her hands knew when the sugar was ready and her eyes could see when the chocolate had reached the right consistency. Her apron had a deep pocket where she kept a pressed handkerchief with her initial embroidered in one corner, spare buttons in a little tin, and sometimes a piece of candy she'd sneak to me when my mother wasn't looking, pressing it into my palm with a conspiratorial wink that made me feel like we shared secrets the rest of the world would never understand. The kitchen windows would fog up completely from all that cooking, from the steam rising off boiling sugar and the heat of the oven running all day, and we'd wipe them clear with worn dish towels to see if it was snowing yet. If the world outside was transforming into the magical winter landscape we hoped for every December. The radio would play carols we both knew all the words to, the old ones, the traditional ones that nobody seems to sing anymore, and she'd hum while she worked, her voice soft and slightly off-key but comforting in its familiarity. And everything felt safe and warm and permanent in that particular way that only childhood memories can feel now that you're grown, and everyone who made you feel that way is gone, and you realize too late that you should have paid more attention, should have written down the recipes more carefully, should have asked more questions, while there was still someone there to answer them. The counters would be covered with cooling racks and wax paper and bowls in various stages of use, a beautiful chaos that somehow she navigated with perfect efficiency. She'd tell me stories while we worked, about her own grandmother making these same candies during the Depression when sugar was rationed and they had to save for weeks to have enough for Christmas, about the year the fudge wouldn't set and they ate it with spoons anyway, about the neighbor who always dropped by right when the candy was finished and somehow always left with a full tin, those afternoons in her kitchen, making candy that would be wrapped in wax paper and tucked into tins and given to people who would exclaim over them like they were treasures, taught me more than recipes. They taught me that love looks like flour on your hands, and patience when the caramel won't cooperate, and generosity when you give away something you spent hours making. They taught me that traditions matter not because they're old, but because they connect us to people we loved and people we never met, but who loved us anyway through the recipes they passed down.